Lack of statistical skills is a common barrier to evidence-based physiotherapy. In this video, 3 clinician researchers tackle understanding blinding in trials.
Blinding in a research study involves manipulating or concealing information from people involved in the clinical research. The amount and the nature of the information concealed varies depending upon the study design and the role that person plays within the research study. It may be possible to withhold information from any of several groups involved in clinical research. This could be the participant who's involved, the healthcare provider providing the treatment, the data collectors, the assessors of the outcomes of interest, the people who analyze the data, maybe the people who analyze the data safety and the monitoring teams, as well as finally the manuscript writers can all be blinded. The ultimate aim of blinding is to avoid bias. Once those involved in the research project are unblinded, so for example, they're now aware of which group the participant belongs to or for which outcome's important, bias may be introduced. And this threatens the validity of our study results.
Yes, that bias can even be subconscious. So the researchers might feel as though they're not letting themselves be biased by knowing who's in which group, but even subconsciously that could influence the way they make measures, and that could be a problem. It's interesting if we look at the prevalence of the 3 different types of blinding in physiotherapy trials, looking at the PEDro scale data. If you look at all the trials indexed on PEDro, the proportion with blinding of therapists and blinding of patients is very low, less than 10%, and blinding of assessors is much higher. And that's reasonable. That's because physical interventions can be very hard to blind from the perspective of the participant or the therapist, but blinding of assessors is much easier, and it would be nice if we could see that go even higher. I realise there's resource implications in having to have an extra investigator in the study, but while we accept that blinding of subjects and therapists is hard, blinding of assessors is really something we should aim to get higher.
It is a really good point that blinding is hard. You know, in clinical practice, we do deliver physical interventions, primarily, and it's kind of not natural that the therapist or the patient are blinded to that intervention. They're both active parts of it. So how much should we care whether patients or therapists are blinded in these trials? How important is it?
I think we should not forget that it's there. I've heard people say, oh, we should just drop those 2 criteria out of the PEDro scale because so few trials achieve them. We should just accept that it's impossible and forget about them. And I think that's wrong from a couple of perspectives. I think we should never forget that potential for bias is there, and we should never want to stop striving to eliminate that bias from lack of blinding if we can. Some authors go to incredible lengths to ensure blinding in their studies. Quite a while ago now, but there was a neck manipulation trial where participants were brought into the room and assessed and then set up on the treatment plinth, and then they the researchers tossed a coin to find out if they'd have manipulation or not, and said then they did the manipulation or not. Then they gave the participants a strong-acting sedative that sent them briefly to sleep, and then when they woke up, that particular medication has a mild amnesic effect, and the patients could sort of remember being in the room, but they were a bit vague on what happened, and then they couldn't really remember accurately whether they'd had neck manipulation or not. That's a pretty unusual case, but other people go to a lot of trouble. For example, if patients have been perhaps wearing a splint for 2 weeks and then they come in to be measured, they might still have erythema on the skin from the margins of the splint. And so the authors go to the trouble of sort of wrapping that part of the limb in a covering so that the person who's coming to measure joint range can't see whether a splint has been on there or not. Or in some trials of a respiratory intervention, whether that should be given before or after inhaled medication. Is the inhaled medication better before the physiotherapy intervention, or is it better if the physiotherapy intervention comes before the inhaled medication? And so people would use a placebo medication, and so they could have the real drug and then the physiotherapy intervention and then the placebo inhaled medication, or swap them over and have the placebo medication first, then the physiotherapy intervention, and then the real medication. And so there are lots of different ways that people can, lots of effort that people can go to ensure blinding.
Wow, they are some fantastic examples. I remember one of the earliest studies I read that's always stuck with me was when they give two interventions, one they think works, one placebo, and they did active intervention of the lower limb, you know, strength and task practice. And then the placebo group did splinting of the lower limb. So they put it in an air cast, but the therapist still sat with them for that, you know, that length of time. And I imagine there are ways to make sure the therapists involved in the intervention and the patients involved in the two different interventions are not sure which one you actually think might work versus the one you're actually trying to, your hypothesis for what might be effective. The other thing that you mentioned there, Mark, was that kind of getting ready for the assessor to come in and making sure the assessor doesn't know which group the person is. You know, when I'm reading papers and looking at the different measures that papers use, you know, I'm often more confident if there is an objective measure or a measure that's less open to bias or to the participant reporting, a participant reported measure, because I would imagine that having been involved in something, they are more likely to report an effect of that, and perhaps having the objective nature of the measure counteracts that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Having a mixture of self-report and objective measures can help you in interpreting the findings from studies and give you some confidence into whether there was a signal from this intervention. But yeah, it can be challenging in different fields. So in the field of pain, pain self-report is considered one of the most important patient-reported outcome measures. So unless the participant is blinded to the intervention or the study hypothesis, yeah, that outcome assessor will be to themselves, and they themselves will be unfortunately unblinded.
There's no consistency in the way that those terms are used. There was a really great paper where a group of researchers looked at a whole lot of definitions of those terms in medical textbooks, and they also interviewed a whole lot of practicing clinicians and looked at their interpretations of what those terms were, and there was no consistency. So take the term double blind, for example. Some people assumed that the double part referred to the patient and the therapist. Some people assumed it referred to the therapist and the outcome assessor. Some people assumed it referred to the patient and the outcome assessor. Some people said, oh, it refers to all three groups. It means that everyone is covered. Some people interpreted it that it meant it was doubly good blinding that couldn't be deciphered by anybody. And so it was meant very effective blinding. And the same with single blinding and triple blinding. There wasn't agreement in what those terms meant either. So the conclusion in that paper, and also which is now in a lot of reporting guidelines, is we shouldn't use the terms single blind, double blind, and triple blind. We should instead explain what efforts were made to cause blinding, and that researchers can comment on which groups they think that was effective in blinding. We should avoid using those terms single blind, double blind, and triple blind, because regardless of what you think they mean, someone else will have a different interpretation, and then they'll misinterpret what you're reporting.
I must say that sometimes when I'm reading papers and there is a statement that blindings occurred, it doesn't always seem convincing. If it just says that, yeah, we did blinding, and there's no explanation of what that meant, sometimes I can't conceptualize how they would have achieved blinding and what lengths they went to within that intervention.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can often formally assess the success of blinding at the start of the trial, but the effectiveness of the intervention actually might influence any guesses of which group the participants were in at the end of the trial. So it can be really tricky to work out if blinding actually worked. And for this reason, and because we're influenced by how effective the treatment is recommendations for reporting the assessment of blinding are now saying that you shouldn't look at blinding at the end, but maybe we can have a look at the start. We can possibly assess the credibility of the interventions to make sure that people think or have a sense of what group they are in.
Yeah, I think that credibility of treatment is a really important issue. There was one study where the two treatments, the active and the sham, were totally different. If you experience both of them, you'd never believe for 1 second that they were the same intervention. But the authors asked the participants in both groups, how believable, how convinced are you that this is an active therapy that you're on? And they had similar scores. And so the authors were able to say, well, even though they wouldn't be the same, be believable that the treatments were the same, they both had the same treatment credibility. That was a worthwhile thing to do.
I guess that touches upon when we're looking to try and control in complex interventions, when, as you said, the control group often doesn't reflect in any way the intervention being tested when we're trying to look at sham and trying to blind participants. So yeah, credibility is quite a nice measure.
Yeah, and look, if you don't have the data as a researcher, then I think it's important just to explicitly explain the methods that have been used to try and blind, and make a comment about which groups you think have successfully been blinded with those methods, and then readers can judge for themselves.
We've talked about many different people who can be blinded in a research study and the importance of blinding on interpreting the study validity. We have a few different explainer documents which we've attached to the notes of this journal club. We recommend you have a look at those and learn a bit more about who can be blinded and why they should be.